thank you all so much for joining us for today's program about the DC Preservation League's Most Endangered Places list. My name is Melissa Laureano, and I serve as the Programs Manager for the DC Preservation League. For those of you new to our organization, we are a citywide nonprofit founded in 1971 that is dedicated to preserving, protecting, and enhancing the historic and built environment of Washington, DC through advocacy and education. I'd like to first take a moment to acknowledge some of DCPL's top sponsors, whose annual financial support helps underwrite public programs like this one today and the work that we're going to be talking about. So they are the DC Commission on the Arts and Humanities, Denton's, Douglas Development Corporation, Antunovich Associates, Atlantic Refinishing and Restoration, Robert Benson Photography, Buyer Blender Bell, Building Innovation Hub, Edens, EHT Traceries, KCE Structural Engineers, and Quinn Evans. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to DCPL's Executive Director, Rebecca Miller, and Community Outreach and Grants Manager, Zachary Burt.
Rebecca, do you want, I guess I'll speak first. My name's Zachary Burt. I'm the Community Outreach and Grants Manager at the DC Preservation League. And one of my main roles here at DCPL is I manage the Landmarks Committee. So because of my role working with landmarks and historic landmark nominations, I'm related to the Most Endangered Places list, and I help work on that. So we were talking about just kind of giving an overview of what the list has looked like since it was created in 1996. And we thought it was a good time for the staff to give a quick presentation on some of our successes over the years, and then also looking forward at endangered properties here in the city. And so,
Sorry. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Rebecca Miller. I'm the Executive Director of the DC Preservation League. This is my 19th year at DCPL. So I have a lot of background information on the list that you'll see today. So we hope we'll give you some valuable information and maybe some ideas. And hopefully, if some of you are interested in getting involved in helping us advocate for some of these sites, you'll become a volunteer as well.
Yeah, exactly. So I think today we're going to have kind of more of a conversation. Rebecca and I are going to talk a little about the list. I've only been at DCPL for about a year, and I've tried to quickly learn about many of our landmark nominations over the years, but Rebecca, of course, can add in a lot of great detail to each property. So I think we'll go to the next slide here. So the list was created in 1996, and over the years, it's included a little over probably 60 properties. And I was talking to Rebecca a little bit about this earlier. It predates her time at DCPL, but I was kind of wondering how the list got started a little bit. I think it's common with a lot of preservation organizations to have a list. Rebecca, what do you think kind of was the impetus for creating the list in the late 90s?
Certainly, thanks, Zach. So the National Trust for Historic Preservation, obviously, is the national advocacy group for historic resources, launched their list in the 1980s, I believe. And many organizations like DCPL across the country also initiated their own lists such as this. Maryland has, for instance, one that's called Six to Fix, which are six properties that they focus on every year, among other organizations. At that time in the 1990s, we had members of the National Trust on DCPL's board. So I imagine at that point, this is one of the impetus for naming this list, the most endangered places. It also coincided with DCPL's 25th anniversary. So it was a new program to be launched during the 25th anniversary of the organization.
Got it. Okay, that makes sense. So when you look back at the list over these 60 or so properties, you start to see there's been a lot of success stories here in the district. So we thought it would be a good time to look back and mention some of these successes, because frankly, some of these you forget were ever endangered because now they're such a part of our city's historic fabric and the built environment. So Melissa, if you could do the next slide, please. Yeah, so the Carnegie Library at Mount Vernon Square, I mean, I think many of us are familiar with how it was looking even about 10 years ago. This picture from Habs, I think from the 1980s, you can tell it's just a completely different neighborhood around there, especially now that the convention center is north of the square. And Rebecca, how exactly did this get going? I mean, obviously the library had moved out to the MLK Library down on G Street in the 1970s. And so what kind of did that period look like from about 1970 to about 2000? as the library is kind of deteriorating?
So Carnegie had, I mean, obviously during the late 1970s, DC's downtown had been deteriorating, there was not much of a population downtown either. Much around it hadn't been built up at that point. I think you can see in the far left of the picture, you can see the NPR building and then Tech World down below it. And then you can see off to the new, or what was now the old convention center site off to the right of the photo as well. And one of the interesting things about it is actually the Historical Society of Washington took on the building in the late 1990s and raised a substantial amount of money to renovate the building and put a city museum in the space. And that was, the beginning of the 2000s. The convention center was just about to open. And unfortunately, the city museum was not as successful as everyone had hoped. And so times obviously changed. We had the recession of the late 2000s as well. Even though we had the convention center to the north, Shaw and Mount Vernon Square had all become historic districts in 1999. But this particular building, this kind of jewel in the middle of this area, just was deteriorating. There was, while it had its somewhat of a renovation by the Historical Society, there were tough times were had by many nonprofits around the city, and so the building wasn't seeing its glory at that point.
Right.
And our friends over at the Historical Society did the best that they could, but there were a fledgling visitorship around, and as I mentioned with the recession, just not a lot of nonprofit dollars around at that point as well. Many of the budgets shrunk for area nonprofits, including DCPL at that point. And so what was proposed in the early 20-teens or mid-20-teens was the Spy Museum, which had been located down at the LaDroit building, down between 8th and 9th on F Street Northwest. And it was proposed that the Spy Museum would move to this location. And so there was a proposal made by the owners of the Spy Museum to privatize the building essentially, so they would take on the lease. And then they would redevelop it, dig out essentially underground and add 2 pavilions to the landscape portion of it. Our first meeting with this proposal was met with none of the consulting parties. So that in this particular situation, not only is this a DC landmark, but it also has review functions by the Commission of Fine Arts, the State Historic Preservation Officer, and the National Capital Planning Commission. So all of these entities, go and consult and talk about what the best options are for this particular landmark structure. And when first we were presented to it, and I still remember walking in, and there were no seats at the table for the preservation community.
Wow.
And many of us were sitting in the corner, and it was announced that, well, the preservation community has already been consulted and they agree with us. And, as an advocate, my hand went up and I was like, well, who from the president? We're all sitting over here. So they went on, and DCPL announced that this was one of our most endangered places for that particular year. It was on the front page of the Metro section, and the Spy Museum ended up withdrawing their proposal and building their new very successful museum down in L'Enfant Plaza.
Right.
The preservation community felt that this was a completed square. Yes, the building needed to be rehabilitated, but it also is a public building and needs to be accessible to the public without a fee. And so fast forward to the next proposal, which when the city was approached by Apple looking to locate a new store here, they have a number of different flagship properties across the world, actually, at this point, where they've reutilized historic buildings and used it as an Apple store. Having kind of a light touch on the building and a promise to rehabilitate the building was obviously very attractive to not only the preservation community, but also to the city. And so we worked towards that goal. And during a lot of the conversations, at first, Apple was going to renovate only portions of the building, but really trying to push for a full rehab of this building so that the Historical Society had a wonderful space. And if you haven't been in there, I would recommend that you go. The Historical Society is doing a wonderful job. They have some fabulous exhibits, and the Kiplinger Library And then you can access the store. I understand that not everybody agrees with it being a retail space, but it is accessible to the public, and you can go and enjoy those spaces now.
And initially, I just have to ask, did Apple want to take over the whole building, or was the DC History Center, was there always going to be that historical piece just because of the public aspect of this property over the years?
The Historical Society holds the lease for the building. And so it was a 99-year lease that they entered into originally. And so during this kind of the tumultuous years where it was the Historical Society was then the leaseholder who sublet to Events DC, who then sublet back to other organizations. And also, I think many people recall going to events there because they used it as a rental space as well. And so it was never any question in our mind, nor do I think in the Historical Society's mind, that they were going to stay in that building. And not taking the major footprint on the main floor, but definitely the upstairs. And so one of the things we really pushed for was that the entire building be renovated so that, as I told you earlier, Zach, in our conversation, that the Historical Society was not the redheaded stepchild up in the attic. They were, a major feature and very important to the history of this building moving forward.
And Melissa, if you could show the next slide, there's a few shots of what the library in Mount Vernon Square look like now. I mean, it's a beautiful restoration if you haven't been in the space yet. And of course, as Rebecca was saying, if you go in there, you see the Apple store, but make sure to go upstairs and you can visit the Historical Society. And they always have some great exhibit. I believe there's a little gift shop as well. And the basement floor has also been beautifully restored. And it is funny because, you have this historical restoration, but there's still touches of Apple, including the Apple symbol out front, as well as the font on these signs out in Mount Vernon Square look very Apple-like. But overall, it is a very nice restoration and a really great, I shouldn't say addition to the city, but continuing our historic fabric here in the city. So now we're going to go to the next slide. And
hey, Zach, before you go ahead, there's a question in the chat as to whether or not there's an elevator. In fact, there is an elevator.
Yes.
So you can access all levels of the building.
Yes, absolutely.
Up and down, and it is accessible for all.
Yeah, and I would think that had to be a requirement in the restoration ADA accessibility. So that is a great question. Okay, so now the next slide I want to go to, we're going to talk about another library. We just recently co-hosted an event with the other DCPL, the DC Public Library, last week. Rebecca was on a panel there. So she's talked a lot about this property. And I know she's also going to emphasize that our 50th anniversary celebration is coming up on May 20th on the rooftop terrace here. So the MLK Library, I mean, as a newer person in the city who loves modern architecture, I think this is an incredible building. And it's by Mies, of course, Mies van der Rohe, and it's the only library he ever designed, I believe. And so it seems just like a given this would be a protected building, but I'm learning that that was not the case, that this was very much in the crosshairs of being demolished at one point. Is that correct, Rebecca?
That is one of the questions at our panel discussion was, when did I start working on MLK? And I said, I think the first day that I started at DCPL was a building in discussion. And it had already been one that had been in discussion for some time. DCPL's Landmarks Committee, which is made up of volunteers and chaired by John DeFerrari and Peter Sefton. At that time, it was chaired by Alex Padro, who many of you probably have known from his ANC commissioner activities up in the Shaw neighborhood, and they were working to research and document this building. There had been a lot of talk about the library deteriorating, which I'll say it here, you've heard me say it for years and years and years, that the DC government is a terrible steward of its buildings, generally speaking, especially ones that they're not sure what they want to do with, so they don't invest the funds necessary to maintain them. And so they weren't sure what they wanted to do with this building. It was so after 30 years, this building, yes, was deteriorating, but because of the lack of maintenance. And so by the DC government, DC Public Library not getting the funds necessary to take care of this particular building. And so there was discussions about demolishing it and building a new library up the street. There was discussion of privatizing it and using it for office space. There was also discussion of having a mixed use development of retail and residential on top, adding to the top of it.
Wow.
So all of these things were in flux and nobody kind of knew exactly what was going to happen. So DCPL did file the landmark nomination on the building in 2005, and it was designated in 2007. And now the rehabilitation of the building didn't actually start until about 2014. And so this is another public building that had to go through the same process where you were dealing with the Commission of Fine Arts and also the National Capital Planning Commission and the State Historic Preservation Officer, and reviewing. And when I talk about Section 106, what that is it's a review process under the National Historic Preservation Act, where you take into consideration the historic resource and you try to avoid any impact on it. And if you can't avoid it, you minimize and mitigate for whatever that is. And so there were changes that needed to be made to the building in order to make it more accessible and more light filled and more inviting for the public as well. And so some of the changes that were made to the original building were mitigated in ways like a new archaeological collection portion or storage for the archaeological collection of the District of Columbia. There are also exhibit space so people can see the archaeological finds that the city has. And so those will hopefully be on display in the future. But it's, these are the types of things with a give and take of where you're having buildings be adaptively reused, or this was not a reuse, this was its original design intent, but changes being made for a more user-friendly environment moving forward, but also mitigating for that loss of historic fabric.
Right, and Rebecca, I think you bring up an interesting point about the mitigation. Mitigation, you can really think outside the box. I believe at the panel they mentioned one of the mitigation features was a video on Mies, right?
Yes.
A documentary. So the mitigation doesn't have to be location specific, which I think some people might think it has to be location specific, but it could be all sorts of things. It could be a website or something along those lines that's education and outreach oriented. So,
and I think many people in DC don't necessarily know much about Mies van der Rohe. I mean, he's a very prolific architect from the mid-century, died actually before this was built. Was selected by the General Services Administration to design this library, because at that point we did not have home rule when this was designed in 1969 to 1972 when it was built. And so this was, federal government telling the District of Columbia what they wanted, basically. But this is Mies van der Rohe being this name architect who you see a lot of his work in Chicago. And of course, people from Illinois are very well versed in Mies, where DC isn't. So.
Exactly. Yeah, the federal center there with the Calder flamingo and all that's very iconic. So Melissa, if you could show the next slide, please. This includes some of the renovation work that was done. So there are the pieces of the library that look like still 1972. And then you go into the stairwell, it's ultra modern. The reading room here, it looks like they cut into both floors, right? Because if I recall, the library used to not have, you couldn't look into another floor like this beforehand. And Rebecca, do you want to just talk briefly about the terrace, which I think that's the most interesting part of the restoration and how the building was designed to maybe support something like that?
It was designed to have an additional floor on it, which was never built. There were the funds to do it. And so when this was originally proposed, it was kind of this back and forth of like, well, you do have the original design, but then you have the as-built. And so how do you make that determination? And so there was a lot of back and forth about what it would look like, whether it be a full floor, would it be a partial floor, which it is now. And obviously the goal of a lot of additions on rooftops here in Washington is to avoid seeing the addition unless you're further away. So like when you're on the street level, you're not necessarily seeing this. It's a great addition of public space. It's a beautiful place to go read a book or eat your lunch or do any number of things, or go to a party on May 20th. And so, and you have a sweeping view around you of the portrait gallery and looking down 9th Street at all the great, 9th and F is one of my favorite corners in the city because you just have this juxtaposition of different buildings. And so you get to experience the city from a different level on top of the
Exactly.
rooftop.
Yeah, I love that new perspective of looking out over the portrait gallery. It's so cool. So highly recommend if you haven't been up there yet. And as we will say one more time, and we won't say it again, May 20th, our event is there. So please look into registering for that event if you haven't already. And the thing that's cool is 50th anniversary for us and the MLK Library. It just happens to kind of coincide like that. So, okay, let's go to the next slide, and we'll talk about another success story. We're going to move away from libraries to more of the traditional DC memorials and monuments. When Rebecca and I were talking about this, this is something I wasn't super familiar with here in the city. And I said to Rebecca, I go, so was the problem with the DC War Memorial is it wasn't treated like the other memorials out on the National Mall? I mean, you have a hard time imagining the Lincoln Memorial being in a state of deterioration, even though it's just right down the path from the DC War Memorial. So Rebecca, do you want to speak a little bit about that, how this got going, and was the deterioration really bad at the site, or how did this come along?
It was. At one point, there was a tree growing out of the dome.
Oh my gosh. Okay.
It had not seen any major renovation work. Just in the sense of kind of how DC, and many of you have long been DC residents, and the kind of the lack of how the city kind of declined towards the late 70s and into the 80s, and then was kind of downtown was kind of making its more uphill in the mid 90s. A lot of these structures, just didn't see the maintenance that they needed. Also, this is kind of one of those memorials that's kind of in flux. It is on Park Service land. It is a DC memorial. It is actually stewarded by the National Park Service. So when this was another one that was kind of in our laps when I first started at DCPL, and it really it didn't need, from when you think about what a project needs in order to restore this memorial, it needed like $3 million, which doesn't seem like a grand amount of money when you think about what the government spends on other things. Mm-hmm. And we couldn't get anyone interested in doing this, whether it was the DC government or the National Park Service would say they didn't have the funds to do it, which the National Park Service for decades has been underfunded, and also at a point where they were losing funding as well every year in the federal budget. So there just wasn't really the money. And then there was a lot of stories that took place after we listed the most endangered places list. And Frank Buckles, who was the last surviving World War I veteran, also championed this with us. Okay. There was a push at one point, a discussion about possibly turning this into a DC and national World War I memorial. That is not something that district officials were interested in, because this was their memorial, and I think the constant struggle for home rule and having the federal government in our city was not palatable for it to be a national war memorial. So we continued on, and then it was during the recession, when we had the stimulus funds in the Obama administration, that this was a shovel-ready project. They knew what they wanted to do. It needed this restoration work done. And so the funds were allocated for, actually $10 million was allocated for this site. Wow. It only needed 3, as I mentioned, 3 and a half. Gosh. Yes, and so
that would have been in 2009 or so.
2009, and it was rededicated in 2011, and we had a wonderful reopening ceremony. We had the Duke Ellington School of Performing Arts Band playing in the round up inside in the bandstand, because it does hold a band, and we had a great set of speakers and everybody who was really excited to see this site back in reuse. And this is a very big site for weddings at this point. The National Park Service has a lot of permits pulled for having weddings at this particular site. So.
Oh, for sure. I feel like every time I pass it, I see a bride and groom or a groom and groom in there getting married. So, okay.
Who doesn't want a free wedding venue in DC?
Right. And also, as you were talking and you were speaking about the DC aspect and how it was kind of a DC centric memorial, a little bit forgotten, even though managed by the National Park Service. I mean, it is remarkable that it wasn't even added to the National Register until 2014. I mean, that says a lot right there. Traditionally, something like this would have been added easily within 50 years, if not earlier. So yeah, I think that says a lot about how it was kind of a forgotten memorial, but not anymore, luckily.
Yeah, and it's a contributing building within a contributing structure within the National Mall Historic District.
Good point.
There was never any question of it being torn down. It was really, our list is really about deterioration and lack of maintenance, deterioration, any number of these things.
Right. So let's go to the next slide. And we're going to switch gears again. Now we're going to talk about Uline Arena and the Washington Coliseum. I think this, if you had to summarize this property and its historic significance, you would say that the Beatles performed here in 1964. And I know DCPL at a certain point, we had a big celebration for Beatlemania that got a lot of press attention. But what did this site look like when you first encountered it?
Douglas Development had purchased it when I first saw it. Prior to that, it had been a waste transfer station. Waste Management owned it. And so it was trash trucks and trash and not in a good state inside. Previous to that, it had been,
the trucks were parking inside?
Inside, yes.
The old arena, wow.
It's a large, expansive space. And so you could drive in, you could drive out. After it was listed in most endangered places. This was another one that right when I started was another property that was at the top of the list for saving. At that point, the Landmarks Committee was preparing the landmark nomination for this. They had not worked much with Douglas Development Corporation in many years at that point. And so we're unsure about what was going to happen with the building. So out of abundance of caution, filed the landmark nomination on the site in order for it to be protected from any ill fate. And Douglas Development was very cooperative with us. They looked for a number of years for a music venue to go in here. And couldn't find, they were talking about the potential for some kind of musical museum, those types of things to go in, like something like you would see at 930 Club-esque or something, but just really couldn't find the right operators for it. And so, and of course, then the recession hit and it remained a parking lot. It was, they were parking cars in it for a number of years, using it for different artist uses too. They would do artist productions and just kind of utilize the space for, whatever it could be used for. And then DCPL did hold the 50th anniversary of the Beatles celebration in 2014 there, where we had 3,300 people who came to the event. It was kind of this great opportunity to kind of merge historic preservation and pop culture. And if you looked at the audience, the way that they were jamming out to this Beatles cover band, you would have thought you were actually at a real concert. So it was it really kind of spurred the development. It got so much press attention and people were really excited about it. And the photographer that we work with, Jason Hornick, he did a documentary that's actually on DCPL's YouTube site on the history of this particular building that Douglas used to market the site to REI and other tenants in the building. So it was a real partnership opportunity with DCPL and Douglas to really highlight this really unique structure in DC. And, DC is known for kind of housing and office space. It doesn't have these kinds of other structures, generally speaking.
Yeah, and let's go to, since you mentioned REI, let's go to the next slide. And we have a picture of what it looks like now with that sporting goods store there. And I remember when I went in that store a few years back, I thought it was kind of a cool touch. And this is not necessarily historic preservation specific, but I thought it was a cool touch that inside the store on the concrete pillars, they had put, old concert posters as part of the aesthetic in the store. So you had people that would go to the store, REI newer people to DC and go, oh, it's interesting. Why are these concert posters here? And then they could maybe prompt them to learn more about what this site was. So I thought that was a nice little touch. And you see here on the left, when they were doing the renovation, I can't even imagine that there were giant dump trucks driving through now the aisles of where you can, buy snowboards and things like that. So that's kind of a funny thing to think of.
And they had to fill in the space. I mean, it was you no longer have the feeling of the dome unless you're outside. And
yeah, that's a really good point. Mm-hmm.
And and there have been criticisms about this is an adaptive reuse project. This is not a straight preservation project, and it was not an easy building to deal with because of what it is. Mm-hmm. And so there were, some roof cutouts that were done in order for balconies at the top floor to get light into it, to be quite honest. Yeah. Because of the concrete barrel that doesn't allow for light except for the front and the back. So,
and I think you raise a really good point of when you have these properties on the list, you have to approach every property individually. You have Uline here. You can't have the same approach here that you would have on the MLK library. And you can't treat the central library like you would Uline Arena. And that's not even including the bureaucratic piece of the Section 106 or Commission of Fine Arts, things like that. But you have to look at each one as a separate entity and really tailor it to what's best for the community. So let's go to the next slide. Yeah, the Georgetown streetcar tracks, which I think this is a really neat project. And I just always assumed that these had been preserved. I didn't realize that there was a point in time where they really might have been totally removed from the street. And these are mainly on O and P streets west of Wisconsin Avenue. And so, Rebecca, was there community activism here? How exactly did this kind of get the traction, no pun intended?
I apologize, my phone is ringing on the computer. 1 second.
Oh, yeah, no problem.
I don't know how to turn it off. Sorry. It'll stop in just a second. There we go. We have Google Voice, y'all, so it just kind of pops up sometimes.
Yeah,
so the streetcar tracks, for those of you who don't remember, we don't have a before picture on here, but they sloped down. So the tracks were kind of built up and then kind of curved down to where the parking areas were. And much of the complaints from the residents were, just the danger of that, especially in icy or wintry weather, and sliding into other cars and just not being great paths for cars to travel on. And so there was discussion about removing them. And we felt, this is an important aspect of DC's history and streetcar history in DC. And so we really pushed for these specific ones on O and P Street to be preserved. There was kind of a lot of back and forth, a lot of community support and some against, because just everybody kind of wanting something different, not knowing necessarily the history, or maybe just like, I don't need this, I don't really care about this being outside of my house. I want to just be able to park my car so with ease. So it did take some time to get this done. This was listed in 2008, and I don't think it was completed until 2012 or so.
2012. Yeah.
2012. And so this was just kind of a long-standing project, but I think it's beautiful if you haven't been out to kind of walk those streets. You really kind of get this nice kind of earlier Washington feel because of the streets, the buildings that are on these particular streets and the streetcar.
And because this was in the Georgetown Historic District, I just thought of this, I bet there was a whole different bureaucratic process because of the old Georgetown board, and that kind of is its own distinct historic district here in the city with the Commission of Fine Arts and all that. So I imagine there was a lot of consultation, negotiation, whatever word you want to use, with a bunch of different stakeholders on this that you would have had versus at Uline or the Central Public Library.
And it was there was also federal funds that were involved in this work. Okay. So it was a 106 project, Section 106 from a federal level as well.
Gotcha.
So because DDOT gets a lot of its funding from that. So this is I believe this was a transportation enhancement project. So a grant program through federal highways.
Got it. And this one you can Google, and there's a whole report that was done after this because it's very government centric. So if anyone's interested in this, you can easily Google it and read a report on it. Okay, next slide, please. The Tacoma Theater. I mean, obviously it's an institution of the Tacoma Historic District, right? We're right near the Tacoma Metro. I don't know when exactly this picture was taken. I think it was maybe within the past 10 years or so. And so, Rebecca, do you recall exactly how this got going? I would imagine this was very community driven because Tacoma has a lot of grassroots support for preservation.
Yeah, so the Tacoma Theater Conservancy was formed around, I think, 2005 or so, and had nominated this to the most endangered places list. And yes, Historic Tacoma Inc. is very active in their community with wanting to preserve the historic buildings. The Tacoma Theater is a contributing structure within the Tacoma Historic District. And so we were happy to take it on. There had been proposals, a variety of proposals to tear it down, to add on top of it, to add apartments to the south, I guess that is, on the vacant, the parking lot next to it. And so it just was going through a lot of iterations of what was going to happen. This was another situation where it had some years of deterioration plaguing it, and finding a good use for it. And how do you redevelop the site while keeping the character of the Tacoma Theater and not losing what's important about this building?
Yeah, absolutely. And let's go to the next slide. I think this was a really tasteful adaptive reuse. I mean, I think it's quite beautiful. And
Yes, it nice.
It's now it's a clinic, I think, for Children's National Hospital, or at least office space, something along those lines. And so, like Uline, we have a creative new use that really has nothing to do with, you know, seeing movies, but, you know, it's still relevant to the community with coffee shop and things like that. So I think it's a really beautiful project that was completed. Okay, let's see the next slide. I think we're going to transition a little bit more into, oh, we have one more, Old Engine Company, number 6. This predates my time, but Rebecca was saying this neighborhood, at one point when this area was being redeveloped, this was actually one of the few historic structures left. And if anyone's familiar with this building on Massachusetts Avenue, there's actually a huge condo apartment building that's built around it, and the engine company kind of fits into it. So, I mean, how did this get stopped from being demolished, I guess? I mean, I guess it was on the DC inventory, so it had some protection in that sense, but incorporated into that project.
Well, I don't know that, I guess there was a push at one point because of the deterioration of the building for demolition, if I recall correctly.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
because
even though it was
in
listed.
bad shape despite the listing.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Like there was a question of its integrity at that point. But we had a legal team that actually was involved in that. That's how actually our president in the mid-2000s became involved with DCPL, Edwin Fountain, was because of this particular issue. He was recruited to provide pro bono assistance on retaining this property. And so just kind of a lot of legal maneuvering to ensure that this building was kept, and also that it wasn't built on top of. Like that was one of the things. Yeah. This was, you know, this is a special building. It's small, so it's it's relatively overwhelmed by this apartment building as it is. So you can only imagine if we were just doing a setback of say 15 feet or something like that, how it would just kind of swallow the building whole. This is also part of, there's a multiple property document on firehouses. And so this is one of the earliest firehouses in the city that remains. And so it's an important structure in its own right.
Oh yeah, I mean, 1862, I mean, yeah, when you're looking at buildings here in the city, that's pretty historic. So, and you had mentioned, I think that row house you see in the picture on the left, that was already gone. Is that correct? So it's not like that building was demolished to save the fire station. I mean, the fire station was that was like what was left at this point. So
there were just kind of a sporadic teeth around this particular square, but what you see within that row house is indicative of what would have surrounded this. So you think about kind of right sizing of projects and right sizing of buildings, and they were 3-story row houses and things like that were on this particular square, the majority of which were already gone by the time that this was redeveloped. And this area was not protected other than this particular row house.
Right, and I know DC Preservation League has fought to save these last remnants throughout Judiciary Square, Mount Vernon Triangle, that area, because as you say, there is kind of these teeth that are left over from the historic period. So next slide, please. Okay, so St. Elizabeth Hospital. I know I know you've devoted a whole program to St. Elizabeth's Hospital. So I know you could talk a lot about different aspects of this. Obviously, this has the huge bureaucratic piece because half the property, the western portion, is Department of Homeland Security. But let's go to the next slide. And let's just talk about these particular projects that were recently highlighted at our preservation awards in February. Yeah, let's talk about the center building first.
Sure. So the center building, obviously, it is the gemstone on the campus. It's the first building that was built. It started 1852, wasn't completed until 1870s, or I think 1877 was when it was completed. And the porte cochere that you see here on the front of the building was completed. And it had seen much better days. We got involved. DCPL wrote the local historic district nomination for the site that was submitted, and designated in 2005. It was already a National Historic Landmark. It had been designated that in the 90s, but it didn't have the kind of local distinction or local protection at that point. This, as you mentioned, was this portion of the campus, 176 acres, is managed by the General Services Administration. The remaining portion, it's a whole 350 acres total. The remaining portion is the DC side. This is also, as I mentioned, the main portion of the building that closed. So in the 1970s, functions started to move to the East Campus slowly in the 1980s, and essentially the West Campus was abandoned, all but some auxiliary trailers, outpatient services, and training ground for DC MPD's training drug dogs. And so the buildings were left. And one of the interesting characteristics of this campus is that there's a steam heat function underneath both campuses. So while the East Campus was still functioning and the West Campus was now closed, the steam was still running in these buildings that were closed. So they basically steamed from the ground up, and many of the floors became unstable, and many collapsed within many of the buildings on the West Campus. And so that is one thing that we're dealing with. So when you see this entire scooped out building, there's questions about that from a preservation perspective, but there was a long consulting process on this that started, and in 2008 when the programmatic agreement was finalized, which then resulted in mitigation such as the tours that DCPL did for 15 years. And it's also interesting in the fact that it's a mental hospital that was converted into office space. And so it had to be reinforced in certain areas. And because this was built by the federal government over 30 years, the walls were different. There would be calls any given week that a portion of a wall had collapsed because they took a brick from here and all of a sudden it wasn't 3 brick deep. There were brick voids and things like that. So it was, dealing with a whole lot of issues in this particular building. And you're talking 1,500 windows too. So, and I think 16% of those windows were able to be restored. But, and this is another case of deterioration caused a lot of harm to this building.
Yeah.
So, and that's why one of the things we always talk about, like, you have to button up your buildings, you have to mothball them, you have to make them in order for it not to cost you more in the end. So while we see this as a success story, there are some, disappointing aspects of it as well.
Right. Yeah. And so the center building, I believe it's now what, DHS, one of their main administration buildings. And then the East Campus, because it's owned by the city, it's going to move more in a mixed use direction, kind of more akin to what Walter Reed or something like that.
Yes, and then there is a hospital building. St. Elizabeth still functions. There's a 350 bed hospital that was built and dedicated in 2011. The East Campus has slowly been getting going. We did a whole master plan for it, and they are slowly implementing that plan. What you see, the picture that you see here is one of the Preservation Award winners this year. This is the CT campus. And it is essentially a quad. And so the buildings were rehabbed for housing, which 60% of it is affordable housing, which is great. And so it's just a great project overall, seeing what preservation and affordable housing can look like. You can have quality housing in historic buildings as we move towards those affordable housing goals.
Yeah, absolutely. And yes, as we both mentioned, these recently got preservation awards. So if you go to our YouTube page, you can watch like a 5 to 6 minute video on each of these projects. And it's really fascinating. And you get to see some of the interior shots that aren't included here. So I highly recommend that. Let's go to the next slide, please. Harewood Lodge. So I took these 2 pictures. I took this one on the right just last week, and I took this one on the left also in April of 2020. The beginning of the pandemic. And I was so pleased to see the restoration that's going on here, led by the Basilica. But my understanding is this restoration wasn't always inevitable. And there was a point in time where this was going to be demolished. And if anyone's not familiar with this, it's right across the street from the Basilica, just north of, I believe that's Michigan Avenue. And it was the gatehouse for the Corcoran estate, as in Corcoran, the banker, Corcoran Gallery, and the estate was called Harewood. So Rebecca, can you just speak briefly, because I know we've been talking too much, so we've got to get through the rest of the slides, but will you just talk briefly about this and what the threat was with demolition?
Sure. So this has been a building of interest that for us, obviously you see the MEP list was in 2004, something that we had been watching for a long time. There are indications that this was designed by James Renwick, who obviously was the architect of the Smithsonian Castle. He was friends with Corcoran. But at this point, the Basilica was really not interested in keeping this building. They have a visitor center that's going on the property, just a little bit to the, I guess that's north of this lodge. And so they filed for a demolition permit. And so we worked with the DC Historic Preservation Office and actually had a big campaign on Facebook and social media and asking our members and supporters to write letters to the Basilica. And it was successful. And the Basilica, the lead individuals over there finally agreed to not oppose the designation of this. We worked with them on the boundaries of the lodge. And it became a landmark in 2018, which it rightfully is. And now it's being restored to be used. And of course, they will be building eventually their visitor center to the north as well. So.
Okay. Yeah, it's a beautiful little building. So let's go to the next slide. We're going to talk about another in progress. The Mary Church Terrell House over in LaDroit Park. It's now owned by Howard University. Oh, in case you're not familiar, Mary Church Terrell was a big leader in education here in the city, but most notably for civil rights and desegregation of the restaurants downtown in the 1950s. And then it's also, I would say, one of the most distinctive looking properties in the city because at some point there was a fire on the west portion of the home, and that's why it has this very, very unique look to it. But it's currently being restored by Howard University in conjunction with EHT Traceries and Monarch Construction. And we've been working with them on this, and we have a program coming up actually in the next few weeks or so. So please watch for that, where we'll give more details about that. Rebecca, did you want to add anything, or we can go to the next?
No, I think that you've covered it. It's, one of these properties that's kind of been on the list for a very long time. Howard University was, they were bequeathed this, so they inherited the property and didn't really necessarily have a use, nor did they have the funds to do this. And as you can see, it's receiving funding through the Historic Preservation Fund, the African American Civil Rights Program, which is actually grant funding that DCPL has received as well for doing our multiple property document on African American civil rights. Right. And our Black Power document that we're currently working on.
Right, and down the street also, I should add, is the Mayor Walter Washington House, who was basically the city's first mayor under home rule, democratically elected. Was that also bequeathed to the university, and is that on a similar track to the Terrell House, or is that kind of its own thing?
That's under, I believe they purchased that. I believe Howard University purchased that property. I could be wrong though. I'd have to look that up. But there is currently, they're presenting plans to HPRB and to the community currently. So there is gone before HPRB making progress, yes. As I see Scott Roberts commenting on. There have been a lot of community meetings and a lot of discussion about restoring, it's two houses combined. And so one of the houses that originally had a porch on it, that would be restored and whatnot. So things at Howard University move fairly slowly. So this one actually seems to be progressing quite well.
Got it. So yeah, two distinctive homes on T Street. And like I said, there's going to be a program coming up on this house. So please watch for that. Next slide, please. So, we have to talk about some losses. It's not only been successes since 1996. So one of the most infamous or famous, whatever word you want to use, is the Third Church of Christ Scientist, which is right on 16th Street, or was right on 16th Street, just north of the White House. Personally, I think it's a loss, but I'm sure there's other people in the audience or in the city that are glad to see that it was demolished. Rebecca, do you want to just give us a real high level description of the legal battle that ensued over this project? Because I know it dragged on and on and on.
Yes, it's we call this the hard building to love because there just wasn't a lot of love outside of the academic community for it. So DCPL and Committee of 100 filed a landmark nomination on this building in 1991 when they originally had proposed to demolish the building. It was only at that point 20 years old, but it was an IMP building, work of a master architect, and very much of interest to the preservation community. The third church had a ground lease, actually, so the building that you see on top was the third church. They leased the ground from the First Church of Christ, the mother church up in Boston, and that was then sold. And so this kind of re-upped in 2007. DCPL had a huge focus on modernism, which we still do, starting in the early 2000s. And it was designated a historic landmark. The congregation did file an appeal in court over that. They then filed for a raise application on the structure, which was denied because demolition is not consistent with the purposes of the Preservation Act, and they appealed that then to the mayor's agent for historic preservation, where the legal battle then ensued, which took a number of years to resolve. It did end in an agreement for all sides to withdraw their respective challenges, and it brought into a lot of considerations about RLUIPA, the Religious Institution and Religious Land Use and Institutional Persons Act, takings with regards to properties. Small congregation that the third church was, they were down to about 75 or so members at that point, and couldn't maintain the building as it was. So it did finally, it was demolished in 2014 after an agreement was reached, which established the church. So the congregation did have a space in the new office building, and then a mitigation fund, a grant fund was set up that was administered by DCPL, which Zach will talk about next, to assist other religious institutions in modernism projects across the city.
Yeah, so I mean, there is a silver lining here. So yeah, let's go to the next slide. So, it's not a success in a traditional sense of the building being preserved for the future, but as partial mitigation, the Mid-Century Modern and Religious Properties Grant Fund was established. And it was so successful that it actually has run out of funds. And there's only a few projects that are being finished up that already have their funds appropriated. But this one is kind of unique because it's modern and/or religious properties. But the important thing to mention here is that it's mainly funded a lot of religious property projects here in the city. I would say by far, mainly for bricks and mortar, whether there's been like moisture penetration out of property with the roof or the stone masonry or the brick and things like that. And so here's just some of the projects that it's funded since it was created. And I mean, we have, just neighborhood churches like St. Paul up here, and then we have really famous institutions like the National Cathedral that it's helped fund. So if you go to our website and you go to the grant page, there's a couple links in it, and it shows all the projects that have been funded by this grant fund, including our other two, as well as our other two grant funds that are set up for partial mitigation. So we were talking about the mitigation piece earlier with the library, but this is another example of mitigation more in a bricks and mortar sense of what can come out of these different preservation projects, whether they're success stories like the library or maybe not a success story like the IMP Design Church. So let's go to the next slide. And just briefly, because I know we're almost at the top of the hour, but we want to talk about the three properties we're looking at in 2022. So in the coming weeks and months, we're going to be releasing a new list, a revised list that's going to be comprehensive and include multiple properties on it. But today we wanted to focus on three properties that we're planning to focus on in 2022. And let's go to the first one. Let's go to DC Recorder of Deeds. So this one is down in Judiciary Square. It was added to the DC inventory in 2019. It was one of our nominations that got designated. And it's especially unique because most properties aren't interior, the interior is not designated. And this is of about 24 properties that has the interior designated. And it's mainly because of these beautiful 1940s murals in the lobby. But since then, the recorders moved out in 2008. It's had a lot of damage to the property and just not good stewardship of the property. Rebecca, do you want to chime in about some of the challenges maybe with the roof?
Certainly. So we had the roof has been leaking for a number of years. The recorders moved out in 2008. DGS is responsible for the property, and they don't have a preservation officer on their staff, and they also don't do routine checks of the buildings. And so there, unbeknownst to them, there was significant water damage in the building. Fortunately, none of the murals have been affected. They are kind of encased in to keep them in the building. One of the things that was really important is that they not get lost. And people are like, what? How did they get lost? I'm like, well, the city lost an entire firehouse one time. So that had been dismantled and was supposed to be rebuilt. So I imagine if you can lose an entire building, that you can also lose murals that were designed specifically for this building. And so we went to council in 2019 and we're requesting funds for the roof repair of this. And Councilmember White heard us, came to visit the building with us, and his staff was able to find funds in order to put a roof on this building. But it does have other challenges at this point. It has been sitting vacant for more than a decade. And as Zach described, the spalling and whatnot that's in the building.
Let's go to the next slide since you're speaking about that. A volunteer recently took these photographs of the exterior of the building, and you can see many of the problems with the mortar joints and the limestone cladding and around the windows. I mean, the rusting there, obviously, moisture penetration. I mean, there's a lot of issues with this property. And I think this property, as well as the next one we're going to talk about, we can go to the Cromell School next. This really encapsulates the idea that just because a building has been landmarked, it doesn't mean that it's forever protected like it's in a museum, but rather we have to continue to be vigilant. And sometimes really the landmarking is just the beginning of the process of really protecting a building. Can we go to the next slide, please? Yeah, here's the Cromell School. This is over in Ivy City. And this actually has been a landmark for quite a while, since 2002. And we're actually going to be doing a programming coming up, hopefully in May, on the Cromell School and its importance to the Ivy City community. This was recently in the news because was it $20 million, Rebecca, has been appropriated for a community center here, but it's one of those things that's just always kind of been slowly moving. And we wanted to highlight it because this property needs to continue to get attention despite being a landmark, despite the money being appropriated. Those next steps need to be taken to create a space for the Ivy City community. And we have another slide here that shows the kind of what this property looks like. It's been closed since the 1970s. As Rebecca was telling me, how there's people in the Ivy City community that went to school here. So this has been very integral to the Ivy City community. And so the idea of a community center would be really the ideal way to kind of honor this landmark. Anything else you want to add on that, Rebecca?
Well, it's not just the building, it's also the green space around it. It's a 2-acre site, which at one point the DMPED, Deputy Mayor for Planning and Economic Development, had put this out for RFP. There was a group with Empower DC who put together a proposal for that was not accepted. Another team was selected to put housing on the site. And this is really the only green space in Ivy City. The kids play they play in the road and or in the alleys, and this would offer an opportunity to have this green space accessible. Right now, they did put in some basketball courts and some fields for them to play on, but the deputy mayor recently, even though this site has now been promised to the community, the deputy mayor has asked DPR, so Parks and Rec, to reserve some of the site for future housing. And so you can see where the community has promised something and feels like the DC government isn't following through on its promises. So we're there to support them and make sure that this building is rehabbed.
Yeah, absolutely. And hence why we're highlighting it today, and we'll be highlighting it with an upcoming program. So please watch for that. And now I want to get to our last property that we're spotlighting this year, the Sherwood Farmhouse, which is on the campus of, well, it's at the former Howard University Divinity School. Before that, it was Holy Name College. DCPL submitted a landmark nomination for the campus, which includes the Divinity School and the Sherwood Farmhouse you see here in 2015. This farmhouse obviously predates the campus. It was constructed in 1886, and it's in pretty sorry shape. I mean, if Melissa, do you want to go to the next slide? Yeah, there it is. I mean, that's some pretty extensive ivy/tree that's growing out of the chimney there. Obviously, the cladding doesn't look good at all. But we're happy to announce that this is in the process of being stabilized. Howard and Monarch and Traceries have been working on a stabilization plan. What's going to happen with this campus is still very much being discussed. So this is something where the community and people in DC are going to have to be vigilant to watch how this project turns out. But we're at least happy to see that this is going to be stabilized supposedly in the coming weeks. So Rebecca, do you want to add anything about it?
No, I think that this is, I think what you'll find from all of these projects, you can see that they take sometimes decades. They're not just kind of year-long projects. So when you wonder why we constantly ask for your support, this is what the work that we're doing and why we're asking for continued support.
Yeah, and I think, and this property is interesting too, because you have the Divinity School building from Holy Name College, which is like its own thing. And then you have this farmhouse that predates all of them, that speaks to when this wasn't even a subdivision, but rather it was just rural DC. So there's the two pieces there. And DCPL has been trying to advocate for both of those histories to be protected and used in a new way by Howard. So I think that concludes our presentation. I know we went a little bit over. I'm sorry about that. Rebecca and I have a tendency to talk a lot, especially when we're together. So do we have any questions from the audience?
There's a couple questions in here, Zach. I think we answered Frank's question about what happened to the City Museum. I think I mentioned that it was not, it's closed. And so it was unfortunately not successful.
Okay.
And then had there been efforts to purchase the neighboring property to the Terrell House? My understanding is that Howard does in fact own that piece of property. So there's an addition that's going on the back of the Terrell House in the future with those plans, and we'd be happy to share those with you. And then a question about the old soldiers home, Lincoln's Cottage grounds. So DCPL has been involved in the Section 106 for now several iterations of it with the development that's taking place up there. We did highlight previously, after the earthquake, we highlighted Sherman Hall because the tower collapsed up there. That didn't receive much press. Most of the press went to the National Cathedral and the losses that they sustained there. So we are constantly looking at that. The Old Soldiers Home obviously is looking for a funding source and redevelopment of much of their campus in order to have this funding to still take care of our soldiers and airmen that reside there.
Yeah, absolutely. And then Sarah was asking if there's a way to nominate properties for the list. I think because we're in the process now of revising the list, I don't know if there's still the way to do it on the website, but if you would like to send a property that you think we should know about, you can either email info@dcpreservation.org, or you can email me, Zach@dcpreservation.org, and I'll take a look and we can have a conversation about that. What else do we have here? Someone's asking about Woodlawn Cemetery. That's been a perennial entry on our list. We've always been concerned about the deterioration at that site, and I would imagine that's going to continue to be on the site. So if anyone has any additional ideas about Woodlawn and how to advocate for that property, we'd love to hear them because we are concerned about it. And do you have a sense of how unstable, deteriorated Mays Hall is? That's a good question. Mays Hall is the property that is the former Divinity School that's next to the Sherwood farmhouse. I get the sense that it's also in pretty bad shape. I don't know if you could say it's the same extent as the Sherwood farmhouse, but because it at least looks a little bit better on the exterior, but I have a feeling the interior is probably not very good. So, but that's a great question. And then I saw this came out on a raised notice today. Someone's asking about the buildings at Walter Reed. Several, or more than several, there were quite a few that are slated to be raised. But Rebecca, do you have any sense of the Walter Reed situation? Is that kind of something that the ship has sailed on that and that's kind of moving forward, or?
There is a master plan for the site, and generally speaking, the buildings that are being kept and the buildings that are being demolished has been generally understood through the master plan. I have not, we did just receive the raise notice. And so every time that comes out, DCPL does go through it and check all the properties to make sure that there is not something that we should be retaining. So that is where you see some of the kind of last minute nominations come from, is when we get the raise notice and realize that there is a property that is threatened that we may not have heard about previously. But we rely heavily on communities to notify us. Obviously, we're a small staff of 4.5, and so you all in the community are essential to our work.
Absolutely, and I think that's a good closing point, that throughout all of these, even if we didn't explicitly say it, but grassroots advocacy underlies all of these properties. Without the community, nothing happens with these. They would be demolished. But when people speak up, that's when things happen. And then hopefully DCPL can bring attention to those voices and we can protect some of these properties. So thank you so much, everyone, for being here today. Like I said, if you have any questions for me or Rebecca, you can just email us and we'll be happy to help you. Thank you again.
Thanks for joining.